Here we are.
I'm still a child.
I am the editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. If you don't know the Los Angeles Review of Books, I wish that you would. It's online, and we have now print editions as well. LAReviewofbooks.org, LAReviewofbooks.com. It is we started it out of the same spirit that Literary LA was written. That is, we started it as a way to celebrate the literature of Los Angeles. And I feel like we couldn't, it would never have happened. We're following in the footsteps of Lionel Rolfe all along the way. So thank you for that. And I thought we'd start by talking a little bit about how it came about. I was saying to you earlier that there was right before you published the first edition of it, Woody Allen's Annie Hall came out with its famous description of LA culture. He asked his friend, how can you stand to live in a place whose only contribution to world culture is right turn on red? And so that was part of the kind of Eastern chauvinism that you talk about with Dorothy Parker. Yeah. So what made you decide that you were going to fight that?
It was sort of serendipity. I'd been writing for the LA Times for a while, and they liked me at that point. And I was asked to write a 4-part series on, 4 or 5-part, on the relationship of the musicians who'd come here in the Holocaust. So I wrote, and I grew up as a kid. My mom used to tour with Michael Mann, who was Thomas Mann's son. He was a violist.
Could you talk a little louder?
Louder, yes, please.
Okay.
Do you want me to do my introduction over? No, I'm just.
Speak louder.
And so I wrote about Arnold Schoenberg, who was the prototype for Dr. Faustus, or for Leverkusen in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, which some people think is maybe the greatest European novel. He wrote it here in Los Angeles, somewhere in Brentwood, with the palm trees. And what he was exploring was, how does a nation which had produced Beethoven and Bach, although you can argue about shifting boundaries and all that sort of thing, how could it produce a Hitler? How could it produce a fascism? Mann had a discussion with Schoenberg about what is your music, and Schoenberg went into this thing of explaining his essentially music by numerology. And well, I mean, that really is a problem with Schoenberg, and the reason he's unlistenable is, you think about it, Bach writes music that you have to listen to is based on the mathematics that really are inherent in the universe. Schoenberg is a phony. He's writing numerology, he's writing astrology, he's writing nonsense. But nonetheless, he was getting grants and people were glad that he came here. And about that time, Buffy Chandler wanted to build her building, and she didn't know anything about music, but she knew she wanted to bring culture to Los Angeles. And somebody told her, well, you have to go listen to Schoenberg. It hurt, you squirmed, you couldn't sit, and listen to it very well. So great music is like medicine, it has to taste bad. I picked up a lot of his kind of discussion in my mom's home because we had a lot of people. There was, I can't think, but a number of composers around at the time, Tedesco, and they used to come and have these long conversations. And they all agreed that Schoenberg was a phony, and they used to joke about how only in Los Angeles could you have Arnold Schoenberg getting this kind of attention, because we were sort of Philistines waiting for, or what you call it. So I wrote about, in my series, I wrote about Schoenberg, and I remember it was commissioned by Martin Bernheimer, who used to be a music critic of the LA Times, and he came across this quote from somebody, actually a piano tuner, and he said, well, at least if Schoenberg had been a Nazi, it would have made sense. Schoenberg was a Jew, but he worked very hard not to be. especially in Germany. Anyway, so the first part ran. It was all about Schoenberg being a fraud and the discussions that I used to hear in the house and so on. The first part ran, and there was a tremendous explosion. I had done the worst possible thing because Times Mirror was endowing the Schoenberg Institute. Notice there's a Schoenberg thing at UCLA, a Schoenberg thing at USC. It's like the emperor's new clothes. The guy is a fucking fraud. But that happens a lot. You know, it happens in literature and in music. Everything blew up. Bernheimer felt very, you know, he apologized. He got letters, he got pressure. And Chuck Champlin, who just died the other day, and I don't particularly miss him, he was the art czar of the LA Times. And I remember right after it ran, he got me in the hallway and he grabbed me by the lapels and he said, "That was awful to do." And I said, "What?" "Write about the Schoenberg controversy." And I said, "I didn't originate it. Everybody knew that Schoenberg was putting over, you know, bullshit." Anyway, so I got fired. I didn't write for the Times. I've been written for the Times since then. And you rarely see my name in there, and I'm not being too paranoid about it. But Bernheimer said, "Go over to the Herald." It was just starting. New editor Bellows was there. A lot of the better people were leaving the LA Times to go work at the Herald. They were putting out a damn good paper. It was actually increasing circulation on Sunday, while the LA Times was going down. It was really readable. It was well written. And I did this. Well, anyway, he said, "Go over, write for the write for them," and he told me who to talk to. So the first piece I did was on Thomas Mann, on Schoenberg, and Dr. Faustus. And I realized here's this incredible novel written here in Los Angeles. You know, now you can say, well, it wasn't really organic to the place. Whatever it was, this incredible novel, Thomas Mann, was written in Los Angeles, was influenced by Los Angeles in lots of ways. And I went on to write. The editor said, "Well, what do you want to write about?" "Write what you want to write about. I don't pay too much, so..." And I said, "You mean I don't have to write about the 10 best hamburger stands in Encino?" Which is the usual kind of crap that goes in magazines. And he said, "No, what you want to write about." So I wrote about authors, and that's how Literary LA began. But I wrote about writers who I felt were really great writers. There was a reason for them to be there, not just to be a compendium of all the different people. I let the academics do that. I wanted to write the writers who had affected me. So I wrote about Upton Sinclair, who had affected me a lot and was very much influenced by Los Angeles. All the other people I've forgotten now. I am getting old, and so I have Alzheimer's, and sometimes I forget what I'm talking about. And that's how Literary LA began. And I was writing only about people who had affected me personally in some way and who I felt really were great. Which brings up a difficult thing. How would I do a modern Literary LA?
Well, how would you?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I don't think for Thomas Manns and Malcolm Lowry's and Nathaniel West around it, it's just not happening. But it's not happening in everything. It's not just writing. Despite this gentleman's damn good guitar playing, I usually don't. I mean, I'm like Bukowski in that way. I love my Bach, and that's all I really want to listen to. I like some jazz. I'm a little narrow in music, and I had a good friend who actually I had a good friend who said I'm, a leftist in politics, but a Tory in culture. I suppose there's some truth to that.
Well, my last interview was with James Elroy, who
Also loves Beethoven. I went and
he's a
talked to him
Beethoven.
about
He's
that,
a Beethoven lover. Yeah.
But he didn't like Mark Twain. I told him what I think is true, that Mark Twain and Beethoven are really the same person. They both were anti-clerical. They both were very much in favor of democracy, in favor of science. That's really what they represented. It was, and the Bohemian tradition, the California Bohemian tradition, that of course begins in San Francisco, That's what it was. It was a celebration of the advancement of mankind, not the retrogression.
Well, I was thinking about Twain when you were talking about Schoenberg's new clothes, because it was Twain who said, "I understand that Wagner's music is better than it sounds." Right?
Did he say that? That's
Yeah.
Actually, when I was 14, I loved Wagner. It was only later when I began to see the political implications of Wagner.
Well, and now with what you said about Thomas Mann as the origin of the project, which is an interesting quirk in literary history itself. There are LA writers who we know of as LA writers because they write about Los Angeles. So we think of Walter Mosley as a Los Angeles writer, even though he wrote all of those Los Angeles novels while he was in New York.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't think of Thomas Mann as a Los Angeles writer. Aldous Huxley, when he was here, rewrote after many a summer.
He was
Dies
here
of
for a
Swan,
long,
right?
long time.
Aldous Huxley.
Yeah.
He was, right?
Yeah.
But the LA novel makes him feel more like an LA novelist. What's the relationship between LA literature and writing about LA?
Well, I mean, Nathaniel West certainly writes about
Yeah.
Los Angeles, and you can stretch it a bit, and I can't articulate it too well, but essentially, Dr. Faustus, it's been suggested that before Mann came here, he had lived in Italy, in a place that had palm trees. And there's some suggestion that it was the palm trees in West Los Angeles that somehow moved him to put these things together.
Yeah. I don't know.
I mean, I'm trying to think of the other things. You know, for example, Malcolm Lowry started writing Into a Volcano here at 6th Street in Normandy, the hotel, which I think is still there. If you read his experiences while he was here, there's a real LA feeling to it. It almost couldn't have been done anywhere else. I mean, can you imagine, it couldn't have been done in New York?
Mm-hmm.
And New York, and since we have never, unfortunately, we haven't carried on a tradition, but there was, I think what is significant is that the Bohemian tradition with Twain and London and all that, coming from San Francisco, and then I went looking for the evidence of Bohemia here, and there was quite a bit with the London House and so on. The Bohemian tradition was, in a way, kind of innocent. People still believed, most of them were socialists, except Ambrose Bierce, who was a reactionary, but most of them believed in the perfectibility of man, that you could have some sense of optimism, some good reason, but that kind of ended with the apocalypse, which came from World War II, and the genocide and the Holocaust. And you have this kind of combination. I suppose Nathaniel West really represents that the best.
Yeah.
And Laurie, obviously. But that Bohemian optimism turned into downer, apocalyptical. But it is true. I mean, that's what Los Angeles is. It is like the end of the world.
And then without that progressive hope, you end up with What Makes Sammy Run, and the kind of pure cynicism of the 50s.
Yeah, I mean, not that. Yeah, I mean, the 50s was when it really came out. I mean, it wasn't just Los Angeles. It was like Catch-22. Also
Yeah, right.
The feeling of the total absurdity of life. And one thing people have asked me when to do a modern one. Partly, I have had trouble relating to modern writers. I don't see. I mean, like I know when you look at a Mark Twain, that happens once every century.
Yeah. That's too high a standard.
Is too high a
Yeah.
standard, and I don't think we've really had too much since the 50s and the 60s in Los Angeles, but that's also true of the rest of the country, and maybe the rest of the world, I don't know. Maybe writing has, I mean, I also don't think there's too much music being created either, so.
Well, I mean, you did mention Thomas Pynchon earlier.
Yeah, and I said what is honestly true. I was intimidated by him, and Now, if I remember, I wrote most of the pieces originally as magazine pieces,
Right.
which meant I did them in 2-3 weeks because I wasn't getting paid that much. And pension kind of overwhelmed me. And maybe if I'd gotten into them, I almost felt like I was trying to read James Joyce. I just,
Yeah. Yeah, I got into him and he still overwhelms me. It doesn't go away, I don't think.
Well, I'm not going to do what I sometimes tend to do is to say, oh, I don't understand him, he's a phony. No, I mean, sometimes there are people who, you know. And I had my godfather in Carmel used to get very drunk and he'd recite Finnegan's Wake all night perfectly. He knew it by heart. That always impressed me. I did enjoy that kind of.
You know, I'm here as the understudy for David Kippen, who was supposed to be here, and asked me to sit in for him. So, and I'm going to quote Kippen now. He said, "Lionel Rolfe's In Search of Literary L.A. has spent more time splayed on more passenger seats than your trampy sister." And so the question.
No way. What did you say?
Lionel Rolfe's In Search of
Smoking.
Literary LA has been more times splayed in more passenger seats than your trampy sister. So why do we love? And this is the question. Why do we love driving around looking at writers' houses?
I suppose it's why people look into landmarks. They feel somehow by seeing it, by being there, they're taken in the atmosphere. I understand that.
Yeah, but I guess the bigger question is, you know, Robert Frost said the problem with Americans is that they want their authors to be good neighbors. You know that you know
not
that,
necessarily.
Yeah, but they tend not to be.
I did, in fact, in Thomas Mann tells some great stories about the wars between the Mann family and my family, which I come from the Menuhins, who were classical musicians, and my ex-wife Nigel used to say, your problem is you grew up hearing the world's greatest musicians playing. What was my point? What were we talking about?
Well, I was about neighbor.
Well, yeah. Anyway,
Others
so
being bad
my
neighbors.
mom used to tour with Michael, and Michael was very strange. He was a violist, and he really was the one who explained to his father. His father loved music and understood music. He wasn't a musician. Michael was the first violinist in San Francisco, first violist in the San Francisco Symphony, and he explained to his father what was going on with the music, and also Theodore Adorno, who was a musicologist. He also, Mann worked with him. But what he was trying to explain was the barbaric part of Leverkusen, the Schoenberg figure. And Leverkusen is Schoenberg. And actually, Mann used to go to barbecues. All the exiles would meet together and then have their barbecues. And Mann cornered Schoenberg and says, please explain to me your 12-tone, was it 12-tone, 10? I don't know what the fuck it is. Scale. And he'd go into some metaphysical explanation of, you know, why you had to do this. But they were a little crazy. And I know one time my mom and Michael were going to give a concert at USC, and they used to broadcast on radio station KFAC. And on the way there, Michael threw his viola case at my mom, and we were in the back seat. There was a big war. The tour that they were going to have in the Far East was canceled. And then Katja Mann says, well, you upset a Mann. I said, well, Mann tried to kill Menuhin. It was that kind of, but I mean, they were very strange, arbitrary, difficult people, and certainly Thomas was. And you look at his kids; they were all really fucked up one way or another.
Yeah, but I don't feel like when I see a beautiful building, I don't want to know about. I don't want to know where the architect lived. I don't really care about the architect's life, but we care about our writers' lives, I think, in a way, even more than we care about musicians' lives. There's something about the relationship, the relationship we feel we build with the writer while we're reading a book that makes us feel
Think that
like
comes out of a building that they lived in?
feels a kinship to that writer, and we
Yeah.
want to know the writer as well as the book. More than we need to know
I
how
sort of,
Cezanne
I
lived.
mean, I'm guilty of the other thing. I went up to Valley of the Moon, which was London's place in Northern California.
Mhm.
And he's buried there. And it was a rainy, and I stood over his grave, actually sat down, and I spent 3 hours just sort of being close to the grave. It was raining. So I felt that, like some sort of connection coming from a physical closeness.
Yeah.
But Valley of the Moon is also rather strange in its own way. It's a state park, and it's good to go see it.
Mhm.
You know. We underestimate both London and Twain because people read them as children, but both were able to write for both at the same time, and you can read it in different levels. Anyway, there is something there, and I also got very excited because Finn Frolick, who did the bas-reliefs of London that you see in London Square in Open, and also at Valley of the Moon, were done by Finn Frolick, who built the house in La Vista Court and put the same bas-relief on the front. Now, when I saw that house, and and then eventually I knocked on the door and I met the guy who owned it, and he told me the whole story. It's never entirely clear if London actually spent time at London House, but it was built by Finn Frolick, who was a major character in a sailor in, I think in Martin Eden and also some others. So I did feel that kind of just odd, looking at that piece of property, which was almost destroyed by a freeway they were going to build. That would have been some sort of justice. They were going to build a freeway to avoid, cutting across Beverly Hills and coming through, and it was slated to be demolished. And that's why I wrote a piece in the Herald about it, because I thought I could stop them.
Mhm.
And I didn't stop them, but, But anyway, yeah, there is, place does matter.
Mhm.
It's the same thing like I mentioned to you about Willa Cather. I wrote a book about Willa Cather because she was close.
The Uncommon Friendship.
I didn't write in Literary LA because she didn't have much Los Angeles connection. But the thing about, and nobody ever, she put in her will, nobody should ever make a movie or do a paperback of any of her books. And so finally she died, the last heir was gone, there were some paperbacks produced, and there was a movie made of my Antonia. And it was well acted, it was Jason Robards, and, it was kind of a mediocre production, obviously not with a lot of what you call it, but it was just really good. But there was nothing in there what was real in the novel, which was the land itself of Nebraska before it became farmland. And so when you read My Antonia, it's like you're hearing a symphony with her words, although Willa was not a musician. She was fascinated by musicians and so on. Her words she was able to create this incredible symphony, and you have to realize that essentially the protagonist is the land itself, not the characters. And so the movie was only based on the characters, and they did no effort to capture the land as a protagonist. So sometimes physical things do have a connection.
And who's the LA novelist who best accomplishes that, or poet?
I'd have to think about that.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about this book?
Yeah, what happened was my mom had letters from Willa that Willa would write to my mom. She'd been storing them, and the scholars were always after her and wanted to read the letters, and she beautifully kept them up in her London flat and apartment in a couple shoe boxes. And I got very broke at one point. I'm always very broke, actually, now that I think about it. But I got very broke at one point, and my mom didn't have any money. She was a pianist. She lived, but that was about it. So she sent me the letters, and she didn't even insure them, because she learned if she'd insured them, they would have for sure been stolen. And so I just got them one day in a box. And I think, I got $10,000 for them some years back, and I think they're now at Princeton. But
But you are her godchild.
sort of.
Sort of,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I grew up, because my mom was so influenced by Willa Cather, and I also came to realize from the letters and different things that the character Lucy Gayheart was actually my mother. And Willa was fascinated by musical prodigies, and my first book was about my family, and they were musical prodigies. I think Yehudi is generally regarded as the greatest musical prodigy since Mozart, at least recreating. And nobody's ever actually, so my first book I did was on that, because I was fascinated. I wasn't a prodigy for sure, but my mother and her brother and sister all gave concerts before they were 6 or 7. And I was fascinated by what is it? What makes a musical prodigy? I had worked for a brief while in Psychology Today. I knew a little bit about researching, and there really is no explanation for musical prodigiousness anywhere in the psychological literature. Finally, I found some of the best descriptions of it. Claude Levi-Strauss, who was sort of a semi-mystical but still legitimate anthropologist, and he had some interesting interpretations, but it remains a mystery. What makes for musical prodigies? How when Yehudi played the Beethoven violin concerto at Carnegie Hall, he was 10. And he was this little kid, but he played the music with the understanding of a wise old man who'd been through a lot. How does that occur? How does that happen? Now, normally it happens more in music than in writing. But Willa, anyway, was also very fascinated by prodigies, and she had written a short story early in her career called Paul's Case, and it was about a musical prodigy, but he was like a circus side act, and his parents really used him, and it was very sad. Later, when she met the Menyon kids and she was hired to be their Shakespeare teacher, she became really fascinated because these obviously were real prodigies. And so that was, a fascinating thing. Also, Willa was sort of strange because she was politically, I tend to like writers on the left, and I think almost all great writers are on the left. And you can argue about why this is, but it just is. Maybe it's something in the chemistry. Willa wasn't. She was quite conservative. But nonetheless, she was a really great writer.
She was a great writer. Now, in part, you became a writer because you were not a prodigy. So is that fair to say?
Yeah, what happened was I gave a concert, and my mom actually arranged it, and it was a guitar, classical guitar. And I was 13, and I didn't think I played very well. Later on, my mom says that I did, and she thought, she didn't respect writing too much, except when she hated Thomas Mann. Because they had all these incredible fights, and she would describe all the awful things about him. But Willa, she worshipped. And I said, well, how about Willa Cather? But anyway, I decided I'd never touch an instrument again after that, and I decided just to write, because I really did love writing. I love reading.
Well, I'm glad you did.
Well, I wish I'd kept up playing
A little bit, yeah. But I think we're all glad that you took up writing instead of the guitar, and I maybe this is a good moment to just thank you for your work and thank you for your